Hello, everyone. Welcome to Archaeo Viking, and happy early Thanksgiving. Today is my second video in my two-part series on the real origin of Thanksgiving. I will include the first video in the iCard. Today's video is labeled The Real History of Thanksgiving, Part 2, Massacres and Victory Feasts. Because today we're going to talk about the actual history of Thanksgiving. Last episode, I talked about the real reason that the separatist Pilgrims, not Puritans, common misconception is that they were Puritans. No, they were not. That was the Massachusetts Bay Colony. These were separatists. I explained the difference in the previous video. But this is their history of when they actually get here and what Thanksgiving actually happened and actually meant. So the Pilgrims, the separatists, left the Netherlands in 1620 after fears of being wiped out by the Spanish due to the start of the 30 Years' War and the reignition of the 80 Years' War. So, as well as ethnocentrism, where they didn't like that their children were marrying into German stock and they wanted to stay purely English. So, anyways, they did flee to America because of those two things. And first, they went to the Caribbean, but didn't like it there because it was causing them to get sick and a variety of other things. So they came here to what was now modern day Massachusetts and landed first in Cape Cod and then eventually went to Plymouth, as you can see on this picture, by December 21st of 1620. And they really didn't have a great first year. In fact, they had a pretty terrible first year. A lot of starvation and hypothermia and frostbite. They even had to resort to raiding graves and stores of abandoned forts to get to food, as well as the food stores of the Wampanoag and other tribes who had moved on to their spring villages. They were a lot more sedentary than, say, the Plains Indians. In fact, most woodland people lived in towns and cities, and so did they. It's just they had moved on to a different one of their main cities for the winter. So for the first year, they went through a very terrible events, a lot of death, a lot of starvation, etc. Now, the most common conception of Thanksgiving involves someone named Tisquantum, or we know as Squanto, who came and taught the pilgrims how to farm, etc. Yada yada yada. Well, that's certainly true. It really overlooks the real major figures of these events, and that was Massasoit and Governor Bradford of the Plymouth colony. And Massasoit was the one who was in charge of Tisquantum or Squanto and had him go and start diplomatic events with Bradford and the Pilgrims, because the Wampanoags had been weakened by European disease. In fact, it was a myth that they had never seen Europeans. They were well aware of English and French. So, of course, they were like, well, let's come and try and make peace treaties with these newcomers because they'd been weakened by this disease and they were at threat from another powerful tribe called the Narragansett. And so this is where we get this stereotypical picture right here of Thanksgiving, where because of this, beautiful alliance and this teaching that Squanto came and brought, the Wampanoags sat down to have a multiple day long feast with the separatists, and then promptly disappeared from the picture, which is far from the truth. In fact, this idyllic picture right here, is far from the truth. What the Bradford's accounts and one other account talk about is that the Wampanoag weren't even invited to begin with. They had already made their alliance, and part of the alliance was that if either colony or village came under attack, they would come to each other's aid. Well, while the Pilgrims were making a feast, not a Thanksgiving feast, um, but a regular feast. In fact, Thanksgivings were, despite calling this conception, were actually fairly common among Christian culture. And the first one in the Americas was actually in Virginia. Um, but this was not one of those Thanksgiving feasts. This was just a regular feast. And to celebrate the feast, the soldiers of the colony were practicing their marksmanship skills with their muskets. But Massasoit overheard the musket shots from a distance and assumed that the Plymouth colony was under attack. So he showed up with 90 warriors, according to the accounts, to the event. And then after they showed up, they had a feast. So from what we can gather from those accounts is it seems to have been a misunderstanding that the Plymouth colony was under attack. So Massasoit came armed and ready with all his warriors, and then they sort of had the dinner to cool their heads and alleviate any tensions that the misunderstanding might have had, because the accounts do talk about that Massasoit and his warriors outnumbered them. So if they had wanted to, they could have easily wiped out the Plymouth colony. So they went on with this peace treaty for quite a long time. But the issue is the English colonists, as we all know, didn't really stop at Plymouth colony. Eventually, as you see on this map, that took over a lot of parts, even eventually going through traditional Wampanoag territory right here on this part, including the Massachusetts Bay colony and the Rhode Island colony and such like that. And this increased settlement of English eventually did cause things to come to a head in what would be called the Pequot War. And the reason for this is the Pequot were blamed for the murder of a captain who had been found in the canoe, according to the accounts. A captain who had been found supposedly by Narragansett warriors. And because the captain was British and because the Pequots were blamed for it, they started a war over it. The thing is, one, there's no way of knowing whether or not the Narragansett framed the Pequot, which is certainly possible since they were the ones who found the body to begin with. And two, these events had been sort of coming to a head for a while. Governor Winthrop of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in his journals talks about for the couple of years before the war taking place in 1636 and 1637, talks about the Pequots and the Narragansett being just on the razor's edge from going to war with each other. And Winthrop sort of was kind of playing them against each other, but kind of not. He was giving one side presents and gifts at one time to make an alliance, and then doing the other group with presents the next time. So he was playing both sides, but he wasn't really trying to start a war. Well, a war did happen this time. And so in response to this killing in the start of the war, the British, along with a bunch of Narragansett, went to a Pequot fort right here and massacred them. And they went inside the fort, set fire to it, and slaughtered everyone inside. And it was considered a success by the British. And I can already hear what some of you are saying. Well, why is this bad? The Narragansett helped out too. Well, the thing is, even in the British accounts, the Narragansett, and specifically John Underhill's accounts of the war, he specifically says that the Narragansett asked them to stop, that they were becoming too brutal, that the British were becoming too brutal in the massacre, and that this is not what they had wanted. And that's coming from directly from a British source, not from a Narragansett source. So if the British are admitting that the Narragansett told them, "Hey, you're going too far," we should probably take their word for it. But this was not the end of it. This fort, the massacre at this fort, continued. Started a war that lasted for a year, slaughtering thousands of Pequots in its wake, with eventually ending in, as you can see, going all over Pequot territory and ending in their total enslavement, and sending them down to Barbados and other Caribbean islands, the Bahamas, etc., and just totally not depopulating the area, because as I'll touch on later, a lot of Pequots did survive these massacres, but it was a horrible war that did cause a massive population decline. And in response to this, in 1637, Governor Winthrop declared the victory over the Pequots as a day of Thanksgiving. In fact, the first day of Thanksgiving outside of Virginia in the New World. So there you go. The first Thanksgiving was not some happy go time where the Wampanoags and the Pilgrims sat down and had turkey and such. No, it was a victory feast for massacring a group of people who probably didn't even do what the war was started over to begin with. But it doesn't stop here. So this alliance between the Wampanoags and the Narragansett, along with the Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay colonies and other colonies, continued on for decades. However, eventually it would again come to an head when Governor Winthrop Jr. And Massasoit's son, Pemedicom, also known as Medicom, more commonly known as King Philip, went to war against each other. And it was over a variety of things. The issue is the English started to abuse the alliance between these tribes. They kept taking more and more and more land, as you saw in the map of all the colonies over the years that I showed earlier. And Pemedicom did not like this. In fact, he tried multiple times to stop this, and eventually even took it to a sort of court against the Massachusetts colony. He went to the Massachusetts Bay colony itself, arguing against Plymouth, saying that Plymouth was overstepping its bounds, and was promptly shot down. He was not allowed to win the legal case. In fact, the legal case was won in favor of the Plymouth colony. So that was sort of when Pemedicom, who was already getting tired of British overreachment and encroachment, was beginning to gather his forces. He hadn't gone out straight out to war yet, but he began to plan it in case he couldn't convince the British to stop. And then eventually it did come to a head where in the 1670s, 1676 specifically, 3 of his warriors were killed by the Massachusetts Bay Colony for killing a warrior who they thought was a spy. And rather than giving him, the 3 of the warriors, over to Pemedicom, the Massachusetts Bay Colony decided to hang them under British law, which Pemedicom decided was the straw that broke the camel's back. It was too much. The alliance talked about how it was supposed to be, words like this were supposed to be tried under his law. So he started a war, and a very large and bloody war. He massacred several several villages, several forts, towns for several years. In fact, he came closer than any other Indian war to totally removing the British from the area. It's the bloodiest war per capita in history against Europeans and American Indians. Here's a picture of one of those massacres right here that the Wampanoags and Narragansetts and other tribes did to the British. However, eventually the war did end. Despite lasting for several years, it began to go badly for a variety of reasons. One of those was Pamaticon had attempted to get the powerful Mohawk of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, or also known as the Iroquois Confederacy, but more properly known as Haudenosaunee Confederacy, to join his alliance. Because, of course, if he got the Mohawk and the other members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy to side with him, this war would have been in the bag. He would have won it easily. At the time, the Haudenosaunee and other powerful tribes, such as the Cherokee and Creek and such, vastly outnumbered the Europeans on the continent. But the Mohawk and other Haudenosaunee tribes sided with the British. And then a bunch of Wampanoags who were on islands closer to the British also began siding with the British. But that still wasn't quite the end of it. He still kept fighting and still was gaining victories until one day a group of British militia and Narragansett allies were coming through a swamp and saw a runner running through the swamp, and they shot and killed him. And the runner turned out to be Pamaticon himself, who was on his way to from getting allies. He had just gotten more allies to open this war and was on his way back to his base. And unfortunately, through a bad stroke of luck, came across that militia. And so with his death, the war came to an end. They chopped off his head and hang it on a pike, put it on a pike, and it stayed there for years, decaying. Very horrible, very, very horrible events. And so, in honor of winning this war, Governor Winthrop Jr. declared August 17th a day of Thanksgiving. So here we have another day of Thanksgiving that was declared as a victory for massacring a whole bunch of American Indians. Again, this is not a happy-go-lucky story, not the story that we see in pictures. These were warriors who were fighting for people, not just warriors. These were people fighting for their survival, fighting to keep their land, fighting to stop European encroachment. And then they were promptly massacred after having made alliances, for that matter, and then had their deaths celebrated as some measuring point of greatness by their murderers. So that's sort of how the first few Thanksgivings went. But they weren't always, after this, they weren't always celebrated year after year. So, and they weren't even national holidays for a good chunk of the U.S.'s history, let alone the British colony's history. So, with that in mind, what turned it into a national holiday? How did it come from these victory feasts for battles and massacres into the national holiday that we have today? That, you know, these feasts weren't even originally on November at all. Well, it comes from this man right here, President Abraham Lincoln, who in the 1860s made Thanksgiving a national holiday as a way to unify the U.S. In the wake of the Civil War. and also as a way to sort of distract from his hanging of 68 Lakota from the Great Lakota Uprising out west in, I want to say, Nebraska. So this is where we get on Marvin Day Thanksgiving, is a way to distract from yet another massacre, and is a way to unify the North and South in the wake of the Civil War, which of course still doesn't justify the massacres that happened in the past of the first few Thanksgivings. Now, something that must also be stated before the video ends, another common misconception is that because of these wars, the Pequot and the Wampanoag went extinct or disappeared, which is far from the truth. In fact, they still exist as tribes to this day. So right here we have a group at the National Congress of American Indians, right here, who are from the Eastern Pequot Band. As you can see, they're still a very they're still a tribe that's in existence, very much so. And then over here we have the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. So both of these tribes still exist, and to claim that they are wiped out is a travesty and a disrespect to them, especially after we've made holidays honoring the slaughter of their ancestors. So I think to respect them, we should acknowledge that they still exist and that their cultures are still very much alive to this day. Now, that in mind, this video sounded like, I know what it sounded like. It sounded like a derision and an attack on Thanksgiving itself. And it was. But the thing is, I'm not saying that you can't celebrate Thanksgiving. In fact, Indigenous people, for the most part, aren't even saying you can't celebrate Thanksgiving. They're just asking you to acknowledge the mistakes of the past, to acknowledge what we did in the past while celebrating it. I, in fact, am still going to celebrate it. My father is an Indigenous, an American Indian, and we still celebrate it. And the thing is, and I know I'm completely Scandinavian and white in feature, that comes from my mother's side. Anyways, but I am American Indian, but only so much as my father is, who is completely American Indian. And we still celebrate Thanksgiving. Of course, it also helps that I'm not Christian, and so it has a different meaning for me. It's really just a way for us to get together with the family. But even with that aside, we still acknowledge what happened in the past, and we don't try to hide it, and we admit that these were travesties. And so I'm asking you something that really I, as a predominantly white, despite my father being American Indian, to acknowledge these mistakes in the past, to acknowledge that these cultures still exist, and to learn about these cultures, whether it be you live in the Pacific Northwest, the Southeast, the Texas, the New England, Canada, what have you. Learn about these cultures. Learn about how colonization affected them. Learn about what makes them unique and important in their own ways. Because while we can still most definitely celebrate Thanksgiving, we can't keep erasing them. We can't keep dressing our children up in stereotypical Indian costumes and pilgrim costumes and think that that's okay. So with that, I'm going to step off my high horse, and I really hope that you look at and listen to other Indigenous voices. Again, I can only go so far, but I really hope you listen to this video and you enjoy it. And this helps you, learn something, and maybe, convinces you to acknowledge the sins of the past, and gets you to learn about other cultures. Thank you for watching the video. My previous video and other videos on the subject will be in the iCard, and have a good day.